The Larry Nassar case, when a coach crosses all barriers of morality. Chapter 1. The Doctor America Trusted. In the gleaming gymnasiums of American elite athletics, where young dreams are forged into Olympic gold, one man held a position of unprecedented trust and influence. Dr. Lawrence Gerard Nassar was not just any sports medicine physician. He was the doctor who treated America's gymnastics royalty, the man whose hands were believed to heal the bodies that would represent the United States on the world's biggest stages. For over 2 decades, Nassar served as the team physician for USA Gymnastics and Michigan State University, treating some of the most celebrated athletes in American sports history. Olympic champions like Simone Biles, Ali Raisman, and Michaela Maroney passed through his treatment rooms, trusting him with their bodies, their careers, and their futures. Parents across the country felt honored when their daughters were selected to train with coaches who worked alongside the renowned Dr. Nassar. His reputation was impeccable, built on years of dedicated service to the sport he claimed to love. Nassar had authored numerous research papers, spoken at international conferences, and was considered one of the foremost experts in sports medicine for gymnasts. He understood the unique physical demands placed on these young athletes and positioned himself as their protector, the one person who could keep them healthy enough to achieve their Olympic dreams. But behind the white coat and medical credentials lay a predator of unimaginable scope and calculation. The same hands that parents trusted to heal their daughters' injuries were systematically abusing them under the guise of medical treatment. The examination rooms that should have been sanctuaries of healing became crime scenes where hundreds of young girls were violated by a man who used his medical authority to commit unspeakable acts. The Larry Nassar case would become one of the largest sexual abuse scandals in sports history, exposing not just the crimes of one individual, but the systemic failures of multiple institutions that enabled his abuse to continue for decades. USA Gymnastics, Michigan State University, and the United States Olympic Committee would all face scrutiny for their roles in creating an environment where a predator could operate with impunity. When the truth finally emerged, it would shatter the faith of countless families who had entrusted their children to the American gymnastics system. The sport that had brought joy and pride to millions would be forever tainted by the revelation that its most trusted medical professional had been systematically abusing the very athletes he was supposed to protect. The investigation that followed would reveal the staggering scope of Nassar's crimes. Over 500 victims spanning 3 decades of abuse. But perhaps even more shocking would be the discovery of how many people in positions of authority had failed to act on reports of his inappropriate behavior, allowing the abuse to continue and new victims to be created. Chapter 2. The Making of a Monster in Plain Sight. Lawrence Gerard Nassar was born on August 16, 1963, in Farmington Hills, Michigan, into a middle-class family that valued education and achievement. His childhood appeared unremarkable to outside observers, but those who knew him well would later recall subtle signs of the manipulative and controlling behavior that would characterize his adult crimes. From an early age, Nassar displayed an intense interest in athletics and medicine, particularly the intersection of the two fields. He was drawn to gymnastics, not as a participant, but as an observer, spending countless hours studying the sport's technical demands and the injuries that commonly affected its practitioners. This early fascination would later provide him with the expertise and credibility that enabled his crimes. Nassar's academic career was exemplary, earning his undergraduate degree from the University of Michigan before completing his medical degree at Michigan State University College of Osteopathic Medicine in 1993. His professors and classmates described him as dedicated and knowledgeable, someone who seemed genuinely passionate about helping athletes achieve their potential while staying healthy. During his medical training, Nassar began developing the techniques and justifications that would later enable his abuse. He studied legitimate osteopathic treatments that involved internal manipulation, learning how to perform procedures that could easily be used to mask sexual assault. His understanding of medical terminology and anatomy gave him the vocabulary needed to convince parents and athletes that his treatments were necessary and appropriate. The early years of Nassar's career were marked by rapid advancement and growing recognition within the sports medicine community. He joined the USA Gymnastics medical staff in 1996 and quickly became indispensable to the organization, traveling with teams to major competitions and building relationships with coaches, athletes, and parents throughout the gymnastics community. His approach to building trust was methodical and calculated. Nassar positioned himself as the athlete's advocate, someone who understood their unique needs and pressures better than anyone else. He would often side with athletes against coaches or parents, creating a sense of special relationship and loyalty that made it difficult for victims to question his treatments or report inappropriate behavior. The culture of elite gymnastics provided the perfect environment for Nassar's predatory behavior. The sport's emphasis on pushing through pain, the intense pressure to perform, and the hierarchical structure that discouraged questioning authority figures all worked in his favor. Young athletes were taught to trust their medical team completely and to endure discomfort without complaint. Nassar also cultivated relationships with parents, presenting himself as a caring father figure who had their daughter's best interests at heart. He would often provide special attention and privileges to athletes and their families, creating a sense of gratitude and obligation that made it even more difficult for victims to speak out against him. The institutional support that Nassar received from USA Gymnastics and Michigan State University was crucial to his ability to continue his abuse for so long. Both organizations treated him as a valuable asset, promoting his expertise and defending him against the occasional complaint or concern raised by athletes or parents. If you're following this disturbing investigation into institutional failure and predatory behavior, please hit the subscribe button. Understanding how these systems fail is crucial to preventing future abuse. Chapter 3: The Systematic Abuse Under Medical Disguise. The abuse that Larry Nassar perpetrated was not the result of momentary lapses in judgment or isolated incidents of inappropriate behavior. Instead, it was a carefully orchestrated system of sexual assault disguised as legitimate medical treatment, refined over years of practice, and enabled by the trust placed in him by athletes, parents, and institutions. Nassar's primary method of abuse involved what he claimed were specialized osteopathic treatments for pelvic floor dysfunction and other conditions common among gymnasts. He would tell young athletes that these internal procedures were necessary to treat their injuries and improve their performance, using medical terminology and his authority as a physician to make the treatments seem legitimate and necessary. The abuse typically occurred during private treatment sessions, often with no other medical personnel present and sometimes without parents in the room. Nassar would create an atmosphere of medical professionalism while systematically violating his patients, using his position of trust and authority to prevent resistance or questioning of his methods. Many victims were very young when the abuse began, some as young as 6 years old, making them particularly vulnerable to manipulation and unable to understand that what was happening to them was wrong. Nassar exploited their innocence and trust, convincing them that the treatments were normal medical procedures that all elite athletes underwent. The psychological manipulation was as sophisticated as it was cruel. Nassar would often tell victims that they were special, that they required unique treatments that other athletes didn't need, or that the procedures were secret techniques that gave them competitive advantages. This made the victims feel chosen and important, while also creating a sense of complicity that made it difficult for them to report the abuse. The abuse was not limited to treatment rooms at official facilities. Nassar also abused athletes at his home, during team trips, and at various gymnastics events around the country. He created opportunities for abuse wherever he went, using his medical bag and portable treatment table to set up impromptu sessions that provided cover for his crimes. The frequency and duration of the abuse varied among victims, but many reported being assaulted hundreds of times over periods of several years. The repeated nature of the abuse was particularly damaging, as it normalized the inappropriate contact and made it even more difficult for victims to recognize that they were being assaulted rather than treated. Nassar's ability to maintain his facade of legitimacy was enhanced by his genuine medical knowledge and his ability to provide some legitimate treatments alongside his abuse. Victims often reported that he did help with some of their injuries, which created confusion about the nature of their interactions with him and made it harder for them to categorize his behavior as purely predatory. The institutional settings where much of the abuse occurred provided Nassar with additional protection and credibility. The fact that he was working within respected organizations like USA Gymnastics and Michigan State University made it almost unthinkable to many that he could be committing such serious crimes under their auspices. The culture of elite athletics also worked in Nassar's favor, as athletes were conditioned to endure pain and discomfort without complaint. Many victims reported feeling that they had to accept whatever treatment was prescribed, regardless of how uncomfortable or inappropriate it seemed, because questioning medical authority could jeopardize their athletic careers. Chapter 4. The Voices That Were Ignored. For years, brave young athletes attempted to report Larry Nassar's inappropriate behavior, only to be dismissed, disbelieved, or silenced by the very institutions that were supposed to protect them. The systematic failure to investigate and act on these reports represents one of the most damning aspects of the entire scandal, revealing how organizational priorities and reputational concerns were placed above child safety. The first documented complaint against Nassar came in 1997, just 1 year after he joined the USA Gymnastics medical staff. A concerned parent reported that their daughter had described uncomfortable and seemingly inappropriate treatment by the team doctor. However, this complaint was not properly investigated, and Nassar was allowed to continue treating athletes without any meaningful oversight or restrictions. Over the following years, additional complaints trickled in from athletes, parents, and even some coaches who had observed Nassar's behavior and found it concerning. These reports described inappropriate touching, unnecessary internal examinations, and treatment sessions conducted without proper protocols or supervision. Each complaint represented an opportunity to stop Nassar's abuse and protect future victims, but each was either ignored or inadequately addressed. Rachel Den Hollander, who would later become the first woman to publicly accuse Nassar of sexual abuse, was among those who tried to report his behavior early on. As a young gymnast, she experienced abuse during treatment sessions, but found that adults in the gymnastics community were unwilling to listen to her concerns or take action against such a respected medical professional. The institutional response to complaints was consistently inadequate and often actively harmful to the victims who came forward. USA Gymnastics officials would typically conduct cursory investigations that focused more on protecting the organization's reputation than on determining the truth of the allegations. Complainants were often made to feel that they were troublemakers or that they had misunderstood legitimate medical procedures. Michigan State University, where Nassar held a faculty position and treated athletes, showed similar patterns of institutional failure. Multiple complaints were filed with university officials over the years, but the institution's response was consistently inadequate. The university's own Title IX office received reports about Nassar's behavior, but failed to conduct thorough investigations or implement meaningful safeguards. The culture within elite gymnastics actively discouraged athletes from questioning authority figures or reporting uncomfortable experiences. Young gymnasts were taught that success required complete obedience to coaches and medical staff, and that complaining about treatment could result in being dropped from teams or losing opportunities for advancement. Many victims reported feeling isolated and confused when their attempts to report abuse were dismissed or minimized. They began to question their own perceptions and memories, wondering if they had misunderstood what had happened to them or if they were overreacting to normal medical procedures. This gaslighting effect made it even more difficult for subsequent victims to come forward. The failure to act on early reports had devastating consequences, as it allowed Nassar to continue abusing athletes for decades after his predatory behavior was first identified. Each missed opportunity to stop him resulted in dozens of additional victims who could have been protected if the institutions involved had prioritized child safety over their own reputational concerns. The pattern of institutional failure extended beyond just ignoring complaints to actively protecting Nassar from scrutiny. Both USA Gymnastics and Michigan State University provided him with platforms to enhance his reputation and credibility. Even as concerns about his behavior continued to surface, this institutional support made it even more difficult for victims to be believed when they tried to report his crimes. Like this video and share it with others who need to understand how institutional failures enable predators. Awareness and accountability are our best defenses against such systematic abuse. Chapter 5: The Breaking Point and Brave Revelations. The dam of silence that had protected Larry Nassar for decades finally began to crack in 2016, when a combination of brave victims, persistent journalists, and changing cultural attitudes towards sexual abuse created the conditions necessary for his crimes to be exposed. The revelation of his systematic abuse would shock the sports world and trigger one of the largest criminal investigations in the history of American athletics. The breakthrough came when Rachel Den Hollander, now an attorney and advocate, decided to go public with her story of abuse at the hands of Nassar. Her decision to speak out was not made lightly. She knew that challenging such a prominent figure in the gymnastics community would likely result in personal attacks and attempts to discredit her testimony. However, her legal training and determination to protect other potential victims gave her the courage to break her silence. Den Hollander's public accusation, first reported by the Indianapolis Star in September 2016, provided the catalyst that other victims needed to come forward with their own stories. The newspaper's investigation revealed a pattern of sexual abuse that extended far beyond a single victim. And the detailed reporting gave credibility to allegations that had previously been dismissed or ignored. The initial reporting triggered an avalanche of additional accusations as dozens, then hundreds of women came forward to share their experiences of abuse at Nassar's hands. Each new victim who spoke out made it easier for others to find the courage to tell their stories, creating a powerful movement that could no longer be ignored or suppressed by the institutions that had protected Nassar. Olympic champions began adding their voices to the chorus of accusers, lending their celebrity and credibility to the growing movement for justice. When athletes like Ali Raisman, Michaela Maroney, and eventually Simone Biles revealed that they too had been abused by Nassar, it became impossible for anyone to dismiss the allegations as the complaints of disgruntled or attention-seeking individuals. The revelation that some of America's most celebrated athletes had been victimized by the man trusted to keep them healthy sent shockwaves through the sports world and beyond. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. How could the doctor who had helped these athletes achieve Olympic glory also be the person who had systematically abused them? The institutional response to the growing scandal was initially characterized by denial, deflection, and damage control rather than genuine concern for the victims or commitment to uncovering the truth. USA Gymnastics and Michigan State University both hired crisis management firms and legal teams to protect their interests, rather than focusing on supporting the victims or preventing future abuse. Law enforcement agencies at the federal and state levels launched comprehensive investigations into Nassar's crimes and the institutional failures that had enabled them. The FBI became involved due to the interstate nature of many of the crimes, while Michigan state prosecutors began building cases for charges that could be filed in state court. The investigation revealed evidence that was both overwhelming and horrifying. Thousands of images of child pornography were found on Nassar's computers, providing additional evidence of his predatory behavior and resulting in federal charges that carried severe penalties. The digital evidence corroborated many of the victims' accounts and provided prosecutors with powerful tools for securing convictions. The scope of the abuse became clearer as investigators worked to identify and interview potential victims. The final count would exceed 500 women and girls who had been abused by Nassar over the course of his career, making him one of the most prolific sexual predators in American history. The sheer number of victims highlighted the systematic nature of his crimes and the complete failure of oversight mechanisms. The courage of the women who came forward to expose Nassar's crimes cannot be overstated. Many faced intense scrutiny, personal attacks, and attempts to discredit their testimony. However, their collective bravery created an unstoppable force for justice that would ultimately bring down not only Nassar, but also the institutional structures that had protected him.
Chapter 6. The investigation exposes institutional rot. The criminal investigation into Larry Nassar's abuse quickly expanded beyond the crimes of a single individual, to encompass the systematic institutional failures that had enabled his predatory behavior for decades. Federal and state investigators uncovered evidence of a culture of silence, willful blindness, and active cover-ups that had allowed hundreds of young athletes to be victimized while protecting the reputations of powerful organizations. The FBI's investigation, led by the Detroit Field Office, revealed disturbing evidence that USA Gymnastics officials had been aware of allegations against Nassar for years, but had failed to report them to law enforcement as required by federal law. Internal documents showed that the organization had conducted its own investigation into the allegations, but had taken no meaningful action to protect athletes or prevent future abuse. Perhaps most shocking was the discovery that USA Gymnastics had actually allowed Nassar to continue treating athletes for over a year after receiving credible allegations of sexual abuse. During this period, dozens of additional athletes were victimized while the organization deliberated about how to handle the situation without damaging its reputation or relationships with sponsors and partners. The investigation at Michigan State University revealed equally damning evidence of institutional failure. University officials had received multiple complaints about Nassar's behavior over the years, but had consistently failed to conduct thorough investigations or implement adequate safeguards. The university's own Title IX office, specifically designed to address sexual misconduct, had proven completely ineffective at protecting students from a predator operating within their own medical program. Email communications and internal documents revealed that university administrators were more concerned with protecting the institution's reputation and avoiding liability than with ensuring student safety. Legal strategies were discussed and implemented to minimize the university's exposure to lawsuits, rather than to prevent ongoing abuse or support victims. The investigation also uncovered evidence that some officials at both organizations had actively worked to discredit victims and suppress reports of abuse. Victims who had attempted to report Nassar's behavior were subjected to intimidation tactics, character assassination, and legal threats designed to silence them and protect the institution's interests. The role of the United States Olympic Committee, USOC, in enabling Nassar's abuse also came under scrutiny. Investigators found that the USOC had been aware of problems within USA Gymnastics, but had failed to exercise adequate oversight or demand accountability from the organization. The committee's focus on medal counts and international success had apparently blinded it to the welfare of the athletes who made that success possible. The investigation revealed a disturbing pattern of prioritizing organizational interests over athlete safety that extended throughout the American gymnastics system. Coaches, administrators, and officials at various levels had received reports of inappropriate behavior, but had consistently chosen to protect their own positions and the sport's reputation rather than the young athletes in their care. Financial investigations revealed that both USA Gymnastics and Michigan State University had spent enormous sums on legal fees and crisis management, rather than on implementing meaningful reforms or supporting victims. The organization's priorities were clearly revealed by their spending patterns, which showed far more concern with limiting liability than with preventing future abuse. The investigation also exposed the inadequacy of existing oversight mechanisms and reporting requirements. Despite multiple federal and state laws designed to protect children from abuse, the system had failed catastrophically to identify and stop Nassar's crimes. The gaps in oversight and accountability had created an environment where a predator could operate with virtual impunity for decades. Congressional hearings were convened to examine the institutional failures and to consider legislative reforms that might prevent similar scandals in the future. The testimony from victims and their advocates provided powerful evidence of the need for systemic changes in how sports organizations handle allegations of abuse and protect young athletes. Share this investigation with others who need to understand how institutional cultures can enable predators. Only through awareness and accountability can we prevent future tragedies. Chapter 7: The Courtroom Reckonings. The legal proceedings against Larry Nassar unfolded in multiple jurisdictions, each providing victims with opportunities to confront their abuser and demand justice for the crimes committed against them. The courtroom sessions would become powerful forums for truth-telling and healing. as hundreds of brave women shared their stories and reclaimed their voices after years of silence and shame. The federal case, prosecuted in the Western District of Michigan, focused on Nassar's possession of child pornography and his abuse of athletes in interstate commerce. Federal prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence of his crimes, including thousands of images found on his computers and detailed testimony from victims who had been abused during team trips and competitions across state lines. On July 11, 2017, Nassar pleaded guilty to federal child pornography charges, acknowledging that he had possessed and produced images of child sexual abuse. The plea agreement called for a sentence of 60 years in federal prison, effectively ensuring that he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. However, this federal case was just the beginning of his legal reckoning. The state cases in Michigan provided even more powerful platforms for victims to confront their abuser and share their stories with the world. Judge Rosemary Aquilina presided over the Ingham County case with a combination of judicial authority and maternal compassion that created a safe space for victims to speak their truth without fear of judgment or retaliation. The victim impact statements that were delivered during the sentencing hearings became some of the most powerful and moving testimonies ever heard in an American courtroom. Over 150 women and girls took the opportunity to address Nassar directly, describing the impact his abuse had on their lives and demanding accountability for his crimes. Olympic champion Ali Raceman delivered one of the most memorable victim impact statements, directly confronting Nassar and the institutions that had enabled his abuse. Her powerful words, delivered with the poise and strength that had made her a champion, provided inspiration for other victims and demonstrated that speaking out against abuse was an act of courage, not weakness. Simone Biles, widely considered the greatest gymnast of all time, also came forward to reveal that she had been abused by Nassar. Her statement, released on social media, added her voice to the chorus of survivors and demonstrated that even the most successful and celebrated athletes had not been immune to his predatory behavior. The courtroom proceedings were broadcast live and watched by millions of people around the world, providing unprecedented visibility for the voices of sexual abuse survivors. The impact statements served not only as testimony in a criminal case, but also as powerful educational tools that help the public understand the long-term effects of childhood sexual abuse. Judge Aquilina's handling of the proceedings was widely praised for its sensitivity and strength. She allowed victims to speak for as long as they needed, provided emotional support when testimony became difficult, and delivered a sentencing statement that validated the survivors' experiences while condemning Nassar's crimes in the strongest possible terms.
On January 24, 2018, Judge Aquilina sentenced Nassar to 40 to 175 years in state prison for his crimes in Ingham County. Combined with his federal sentence, the punishment ensured that he would never again have the opportunity to harm another child. The judge's words during sentencing became iconic. "I just signed your death warrant," she told Nassar, making clear that he would spend the rest of his life in prison. A second state case in Eaton County resulted in an additional sentence of 40 to 125 years in prison, further ensuring that Nassar would never be released. The multiple sentences reflected the scope of his crimes and the determination of the justice system to hold him fully accountable for the hundreds of lives he had damaged. The courtroom proceedings also provided opportunities for institutional accountability, as representatives from USA Gymnastics, Michigan State University, and other organizations were forced to confront the failures that had enabled Nassar's abuse. While criminal charges were not filed against these institutions, the public scrutiny and civil liability they faced sent clear messages about the consequences of failing to protect children. Chapter 8. The Institutional Reckoning and Reforms. The exposure of Larry Nassar's crimes and the institutional failures that enabled them triggered a comprehensive reckoning within American gymnastics and sports medicine that continues to this day. Organizations that had protected their reputations at the expense of athlete safety were forced to confront their failures and implement meaningful reforms or face extinction. USA Gymnastics, the sport's national governing body, faced an existential crisis as sponsors fled, leadership resigned, and the organization's credibility was completely destroyed. the United States Olympic Committee threatened to revoke the organization's recognition as the sport's governing body unless dramatic changes were implemented immediately. The entire board of directors of USA Gymnastics resigned in the wake of the scandal, acknowledging that new leadership was necessary to restore trust and implement meaningful reforms. However, the organization's attempts to rebuild were hampered by ongoing legal challenges, financial difficulties, and the deep skepticism of athletes and their advocates. Michigan State University faced similar pressures, with calls for accountability reaching the highest levels of the institution. The university's president, Luana Simon, was forced to resign after it became clear that the institution had failed to protect students from a predator operating within its own medical program. The resignation marked the beginning of a comprehensive review of the university's policies and procedures for handling sexual misconduct allegations. The financial consequences for these institutions were severe and ongoing. Michigan State University ultimately agreed to pay $500 million to settle lawsuits filed by Nassar's victims, one of the largest settlements in the history of institutional sexual abuse cases. USA Gymnastics filed for bankruptcy as it faced hundreds of lawsuits and mounting legal costs that threatened its continued existence. The scandal prompted comprehensive reviews of policies and procedures throughout the American sports system. The United States Olympic Committee implemented new requirements for background checks, reporting protocols, and oversight mechanisms designed to prevent predators from gaining access to young athletes. Similar reforms were adopted by sports organizations at all levels, from youth leagues to professional teams. The Safe Sport program, which had been established by the USOC in 2017, was significantly expanded, then strengthened in response to the Nassar scandal. The program provides education about abuse prevention, maintains a database of banned individuals, and investigates allegations of misconduct within Olympic sports. While the program represents progress, critics argue that more comprehensive reforms are still needed. Legislative action was also prompted by the scandal, with Congress passing laws designed to strengthen reporting requirements and improve oversight of sports organizations that receive federal funding. The Protecting Young Victims from Sexual Abuse and Safe Sport Authorization Act requires sports organizations to report suspected abuse to law enforcement and provides additional protections for young athletes. The cultural changes within gymnastics have been perhaps even more significant than the policy reforms. Athletes are now encouraged to speak up about uncomfortable situations, and there is greater awareness of the warning signs of inappropriate behavior. The sport's traditional culture of unquestioning obedience to authority figures is slowly being replaced by one that prioritizes athlete welfare and empowerment. Medical protocols for treating young athletes have also been reformed, with new requirements for supervision, documentation, and parental involvement in treatment decisions. The days when a single medical professional could treat young athletes behind closed doors without oversight or accountability are hopefully coming to an end. The establishment of athlete advocacy groups and support organizations has provided survivors with platforms to continue pushing for reforms and supporting other victims of abuse. These organizations work to ensure that the lessons learned from the Nassar case are not forgotten, and that meaningful protections for young athletes continue to be strengthened. Subscribe to our channel to stay informed about ongoing efforts to protect young athletes and prevent institutional abuse. Vigilance and accountability are essential for preventing future tragedies. Chapter 9. The Psychology of Institutional Enablement. Understanding how Larry Nassar was able to abuse hundreds of young athletes over 3 decades requires examining not just his individual pathology, but also the psychological and cultural factors that enabled institutions to ignore, minimize, or actively cover up his crimes. The systematic failure of multiple organizations to protect children reveals disturbing patterns of institutional behavior that prioritize reputation and financial interests over human welfare. The psychology of institutional enablement often begins with what experts call motivated blindness, the tendency for organizations to overlook unethical behavior when addressing it would conflict with their interests. In Nassar's case, both USA Gymnastics and Michigan State University had strong incentives to ignore allegations against a prominent and successful medical professional whose reputation enhanced their own credibility. The hierarchical structure of elite athletics created additional psychological barriers to reporting and addressing abuse.
Young athletes were conditioned to view coaches, medical staff, and administrators as unquestionable authorities whose decisions must be accepted without protest. This power dynamic made it extremely difficult for victims to challenge inappropriate behavior or for lower-level staff to question the actions of respected professionals. The phenomenon of diffusion of responsibility also played a crucial role in enabling Nassar's abuse to continue. When multiple individuals and organizations shared oversight responsibilities, each could assume that someone else was monitoring the situation and taking appropriate action. This diffusion of accountability created gaps in supervision that predators like Nassar could exploit. Organizational cultures that prioritize success and reputation over ethical behavior create environments where abuse can flourish. Both USA Gymnastics and Michigan State University were heavily invested in maintaining their reputations for excellence, making them reluctant to investigate allegations that could damage their standing or relationships with sponsors and partners. The psychological concept of system justification helps explain why individuals within these organizations often defended or rationalized obviously problematic behavior. People have a strong psychological need to believe that the systems they're part of are legitimate and just, leading them to dismiss or reinterpret evidence that suggests systematic failures or corruption. The grooming process that Nassar used was not limited to his individual victims, but extended to entire institutions and communities. He carefully cultivated relationships with key decision-makers, positioned himself as indispensable to organizational success, and created networks of supporters who would defend him against allegations or criticism. The financial incentives within elite athletics also created psychological pressures that worked against child protection. Organizations that depended on success for funding and support were reluctant to take actions that might disrupt their competitive programs or damage relationships with key personnel, even when child safety was at stake. The psychological impact of institutional betrayal on victims is often more severe than the abuse itself. When organizations that are supposed to protect children instead prioritize their own interests, it creates a secondary trauma that can be even more damaging than the original abuse. Victims often report feeling more betrayed by institutional failures than by the actions of individual perpetrators. The role of cognitive dissonance in enabling institutional failures cannot be overstated. When evidence of abuse conflicted with organizational beliefs about their own integrity and mission, decision-makers often resolve this psychological tension by dismissing or minimizing the evidence, rather than confronting uncomfortable truths about their institutions. The phenomenon of moral disengagement allowed individuals within these organizations to participate in or overlook harmful behavior, without experiencing appropriate guilt or shame. By using euphemisms, minimizing harm, or blaming victims, organizational actors could maintain their self-image as good people while participating in systems that enabled abuse. The investigation into institutional failures revealed that many decision-makers had convinced themselves that they were acting in the best interests of the sport or the institution, even when their actions clearly prioritized organizational interests over child safety. This self-deception allowed them to maintain their moral self-image while making decisions that enabled continued abuse. Chapter 10: The Lasting Legacy and Ongoing Vigilance. The Larry Nassar case stands as one of the most significant institutional failures in American sports history, but its legacy extends far beyond the gymnastics community to encompass broader questions about how society protects its most vulnerable members from those who would exploit positions of trust and authority. The hundreds of brave women who came forward to expose his crimes have created a lasting impact that continues to drive reforms and cultural changes across multiple sectors. The immediate impact of the case was transformative for the sport of gymnastics, which was forced to confront decades of toxic culture and institutional neglect. The complete restructuring of USA Gymnastics, the implementation of new safety protocols, and the elevation of athlete voices in organizational decision-making represent fundamental shifts that would have been unimaginable before the scandal broke. The financial consequences continue to reverberate through the institutions that enabled Nassar's abuse. Michigan State University's $500 million settlement with victims represents one of the largest institutional payouts in history,
while USA Gymnastics bankruptcy proceedings have fundamentally altered the organization's structure and operations. These financial penalties serve as powerful deterrents for other institutions that might be tempted to prioritize reputation over child safety. The legal precedents established by the Nassar case have strengthened protections for abuse victims and increased accountability for institutions that fail in their duty of care. New laws requiring mandatory reporting of suspected abuse, enhanced background check requirements, and stronger oversight mechanisms have been implemented across multiple states and sports organizations. The cultural impact of the case extends far beyond sports to influence how society discusses and addresses sexual abuse in all contexts. The powerful victim impact statements delivered during Nassar's sentencing hearings provided a model for survivors in other contexts to find their voices and demand accountability from their abusers and the institutions that enabled them. The courage demonstrated by Nassar's victims has inspired survivors of abuse in other contexts to come forward with their own stories, contributing to broader cultural movements like #MeToo that have challenged long-standing patterns of silence and complicity around sexual abuse. Their bravery has helped create a cultural shift that makes it more difficult for predators to operate with impunity. The ongoing work of survivor advocacy groups ensures that the lessons learned from the Nassar case continue to drive meaningful reforms. Organizations like the Army of Survivors work tirelessly to support other victims of institutional abuse and to push for continued improvements in child protection policies and practices. The case has also highlighted the crucial role that journalists and investigators play in exposing institutional failures and holding powerful organizations accountable. The reporting that first brought Nassar's crimes to light demonstrates the importance of independent media in protecting vulnerable populations from exploitation and abuse. Educational initiatives inspired by the case have improved awareness of abuse prevention and recognition among parents, coaches, and young athletes. Training programs that teach children about appropriate boundaries, encourage reporting of uncomfortable situations, and empower young people to trust their instincts have been implemented in sports programs across the country. The medical profession has also been forced to confront how Nassar was able to use his credentials and authority to commit abuse while hiding behind the legitimacy of medical treatment. New protocols for treating young athletes, requirements for supervision during examinations, and enhanced training about appropriate professional boundaries have been implemented to prevent similar abuse. However, the work of protecting young athletes and preventing institutional abuse is far from complete. Ongoing vigilance is required to ensure that the reforms implemented in response to the Nassar case are maintained and strengthened over time. The tendency for organizations to gradually relax their standards as memories of scandals fade must be actively resisted. The survivors of Nassar's abuse continue to deal with the long-term consequences of their trauma, and their ongoing needs for support and healing must not be forgotten as public attention moves to other issues. The commitment to supporting survivors must be sustained long after the headlines fade and the legal proceedings conclude. The Larry Nassar case serves as a permanent reminder that evil can hide behind the most respected facades and that protecting children requires constant vigilance from all members of society. The price of allowing institutions to police themselves without adequate oversight is measured in the damaged lives of innocent children who trusted adults to protect them. As we move forward from this dark chapter in American sports history, the voices of the survivors must continue to guide our efforts to create safer environments for young athletes. Their courage in speaking out against one of the most powerful figures in their sport has created opportunities for meaningful change that must not be wasted. The legacy of the brave women who exposed Larry Nassar's crimes will be measured not just by the justice they achieved for themselves, but by the future victims they prevented through their courage to speak truth to power. Their voices have forever changed how we think about protecting children in sports and beyond. If this story intrigued you, subscribe to the channel to discover other real crimes that shock the world and the minds behind them.